All right. Welcome to the Meat Mafia podcast. I am joined here with two amazing people. We got Mike Hobart, our special guest, and Salazzo, the chairman and co-host of the Meat Mafia podcast. How we doing?
You guys know I'm doing great. I'm heavily caffeinated this morning, and I'm been kicking for 4.5 hours already, and it's 8:30, so I'm ready to roll.
You've been up since 4, right?
Yep. That's I've made my biological clock 4 a.m. now, and I'm not going to complain about it because I get up before everybody else and all stuff on. So
my goal on Twitter is to somehow figure out a way to make you famous by being the guy who wakes up at 4 a.m.
We'll see how that goes.
Yeah. Mike,
there's a lot of psycho pointers out there. So
yeah. Do you need an alarm at this point, or are you just because some people just wake up and because they have their circadian rhythm wired? Are you an alarm clock guy or what?
I'm an alarm clock guy. So in the same sense, yes and no. Because on weekends, like Saturdays and Sundays are like the days. So like Saturdays are like my cheating day.
Mm-hmm.
So like that's when I eat a bunch of crap food, like overdo the calories, everything. And then Sundays are when I kind of get back and start working back into my routine. And like Sundays, I tend to naturally still wake up at like 3:50, 4 o'clock in the morning.
Mm-hmm.
But during the week, I still need the alarm because I'm sure you guys have noticed, like during the week, a lot of stuff happens when I'm waking up, but then a lot of stuff starts to happen right as I'm into bed too, which is usually 7, 8 o'clock at night. And especially in the Bitcoin space, like people like to get rough and rowdy late at night, especially in those spaces.
Yeah, those Twitter spaces can get intense. And just for the audiences, just so they have a little bit of background on Mike. So, we came across you. You're a Bitcoin magazine contributor and really a generalist who can speak on a bunch of different topics. Like when we first spoke, I didn't even really realize this, but your background's in exercise science, correct?
Yep. Technically, it's exercise and movement science, but like that only matters for the sense of like looking for where my degree came from. So
yeah. And then, from our conversation, you've had a career in that field, and then have also gotten really into writing, particularly about Bitcoin and the implications that Bitcoin is going to have on the world. And I think some of your writing has been some of the best that I've come across, or at least some of the most dynamic and engaging.
Thank you.
Some people will write about, one thing over and over again. I really feel like you kind of cover a bunch of different topics. So it's been cool, the first few months of the year. I think we first got in touch in December, and just being able to sort of see how, or December or January, maybe.
Yeah, that sounds about right. Maybe November at the earliest, but
yeah. Mm-hmm. But yeah, it's been cool, and I know we're interested in sort of talking about some of the health and wellness background that you have. So maybe if you want to start there and just talk, like, what's your background in health and wellness, and then we can go from there.
Yeah. So, man, you guys asked a really good question. Like, this is a question that really the only other person on a podcast has asked me this is CJ Wilson. So credit to you guys. So I can kind of kill two birds with one stone here. So I think one of the reasons that contributes to my success with like kind of just talking about generalized topics and a wide reaching range of topics comes from the sense of that. So growing up, I had a couple things happen to the point that caused me to like my psyche kind of like flipped when I was a kid. I was very extroverted, like in every sense. I was constantly absorbing new information because my parents were very much like the working family, and it was to the point of where like my sister and I didn't have a whole lot of toys. We didn't have a whole lot of friends because we had to like we would spend our mornings and our evenings in some sort of daycare. And then on like on weekends or whatever free time, my parents were usually like, they had to spend like that extra time working. So like my forms of entertainment were drawing, because I didn't need toys to do it. All I needed was a something to, piece of paper to write on and a pencil. So I got pretty good at that. And part of that's my genetics. My mom's a really good artist. And then at the same time, if I wasn't doing that, I was largely just watching educational material as a form of entertainment as a kid. So I was constantly just watching Discovery Channel, History Channel, Animal Planet. Like that's what my dad and I like bonded through, was like learning that stuff, talking about like war tactics when I was a kid, like all sorts of stuff like that. And like that includes astronomy, biology, health, and all this stuff. And those two factors kind of contributed to as I had ADD until I was 24. Because I just learned so much as a kid that I didn't struggle with any sort of educational material until like late into high school. And at that point, I didn't understand how to study because I never needed to. So that contributed to some difficulty in college, which you can deal with that later. And then, but the difficulties in my childhood from when I flipped that psyche where I went introverted, I missed out on the developmental stage in the early kind of like preteen and teenage years, as far as like the really complicated forms of communication and social interaction. Like sarcasm took me forever to grasp. And then dealing with like puberty and like all that kind of crap, and like everybody starts to really kind of change how they're interacting with each other in those years. So I was very much kind of segregated from the rest of like my population of students. So getting into high school, when I was struggling with education and everything, I just kind of said, like, threw my hands up and said, oh, by the way, I don't know like what your guys' rule is about language, but I kind of threw my hands up and said, fuck it. And I got frustrated, and that's where I started partying. And then when I got into the partying, I realized, oh, I could use the partying environment while I'm having fun. I could use it as an environment kind of like for like case studies. So I could start to learn, like I could like really test out different ways of like interacting with people, like testing out my execution of sarcasm and all this other stuff. Obviously flirting too with girls. That's like one of the main points that any of us started partying at that age. And then having that kind of mindset, I was able to really kind of hone pattern recognition and understanding systems, especially systems of communication and like kind of like positive feedback loops and all that other stuff. And then during that same time frame is also when I got super interested in physiology and generally bodybuilding, because going into high school, I was 6'1", and I was 120 pounds wet. So I was lanky.
Yep.
No muscle mass or anything. So I wanted to learn how to grow. And I'm trying to learn across the board, like doing all this different stuff and going through all this stuff at the same time. It was obviously painful and difficult, and for a lot of different reasons, but I think that's where I honed my pattern recognition and like understanding systems. And really it didn't click for me until finishing up my career in college and understanding the kind of positive feedback loops within the body as far as like physiology and nutrition and biomechanics. Once that clicked for me, then I could just like take that image of the system of positive feedback loops and how it produces outcomes, and then look at everything else around in the world as far as economics, like social interactions, psychology of different individuals, because sports psychology is part of like the exercise science degree. And looking at all that stuff, it makes it a lot easier once you understand one really complex system, like the general ordering of things. There's nothing that says you can't use that model and compare it to others. And then if there are overlaps, and then it makes it, and I talked about this in a couple other podcasts, that's where this study that I read, I think it was earlier 2020 or later in 2021, maybe during the summer, where there was a study that came out that said that they have like actually mapped out and shown that learning is better if you have one at least like benchmark for a topic, if you understand that, and then if something is closely related to that benchmark of understanding, then it's easier for your brain to grasp, and it's easier as a concept for like the human brain and the human psyche to really kind of latch on and actually commit that to memory and knowledge and understanding. But I kind of had like my story kind of, I guess, takes a backwards route to it. Instead of taking like a particular field of understanding, I took the backwards route of like understanding the system within that field, and then I can use my understanding of how systems and generalizations work and apply it to a lot of different things, and it makes it easier for me to grasp all these different complex systems.
That's
Which
really
you guys know about, because I've written about education, health, like all this other stuff, politics.
Have you heard the story? I think there's a father who had triplets, and
Okay.
he, I guess, was interested in seeing if fascinated in the idea of, can you create genius? And he figured that if he
Kind
raised,
of like Michael Jackson's dad, but maybe not in that way.
yeah, like these dads get these crazy ideas to start testing out on their kids, but he ended up going and saying, what's the best way or best field to create a genius in? And it was actually chess. And so he raised
Game theory,
all three of his daughters to become top 10 chess players in the world or something like that. And then they've done research on them afterwards, or at least just told their stories. And apparently they're incredibly well-rounded. Like, they've used exactly what you're saying. They've used their genius in one area to then apply it in all these other ways. And I think it's so relevant, where once you get the confidence in one arena and you build out a system to actually have success, it can then be reapplied. Like, it's not just, a one-time, one-shot type of thing. And so
and like, well, and that's the other thing too, is like I love learning. I love really like that sensation of grasping something that is complex, and that moment of epiphany, revelation, that really like like it's a feeling and a sensation, but it's like kind of impossible to describe, of just like that, oh shit, like it clicks. And then like you can literally feel your mind like open up, because that's what it feels like. And I'm kind of addicted to that feeling. So I really like understanding more complex and more difficult things, because one of the reasons I love it is like, once I grasp it, if I grasp it well enough, I can boil it down to a much more simpler like format, and then I can describe it to other people, and then I can inspire that mind-blowing moment, because if I can inspire that, then I know I just created a chain reaction in them, and they're going to help improve their lives in literally exponential ways, like just by me being the filter for information.
Yeah, it's typically a good benchmark to gauge how well you understand a topic is, can you basically break this down where like a 5 to 7-year-old could understand what you're saying?
Yeah. And one of the I guess that's probably why I've gained some popularity in the Bitcoin space, because there's a lot of really, really good thinkers, but there are way less individuals that are capable of writing on a layman's term. It's like Robert Breedlove, like he's one of my favorite writers. Like he's one of the ones that really, like, I loved reading his stuff. While it's a bit wordy for my preference, his flow and his voice is like, it's more like reading a song than it is like reading a textbook or something like that. And that's kind of like, I guess that's kind of like, I'm trying to take a little bit of that, like have some of the flow, but then have some of the textbook information, but then word it in a way that feels more like a conversation, right? I guess that's probably why I've gotten a little popular.
It's a really unique skill, and I don't think a lot of people have it, because you're able to bridge the genius of someone like Saifuddin or Breedlove in their way to speak to these topics that are in a lot of ways very, very challenging. and you can
Yeah.
speak to them at a level that is at least digestible for, 1 to 2 levels of people, like people who are just getting started with understanding Bitcoin, which, I think if you didn't go to business school or study, economics, like
Or exercise science.
exercise science, good luck picking up like,
Well, and like
sorry.
that's the thing. That's the kind of the point for like what I do, why I love to do what I do as far as writing, is because we can't affect a positive impact on society, especially the positive impacts that the three of us agree are necessary. We can't instill those positive effects and get them started if we don't at least get people starting in the actual revolution of the mind and understanding. If we don't get that started, if we don't help inspire oh shit, our system is broken in a lot of different ways and they're all interconnected and interrelated. If we don't help people bridge that gap, then yeah, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Then like a lot of people are going to get hurt. And like I just want to try and save as many people as possible.
Yeah. And that's the interesting thing too, Mike, about the convergence, as Harry loves to say, between nutrition, physical fitness, Bitcoin, et cetera, is it's like, in order to be able to take action, you almost need to develop these systems between nutrition, physical fitness, et cetera, that you almost like build your baseline and build the machinery to actually be able to be a person that can take action. So
yeah,
I don't know how you feel about that, but would love to dig into that with you too.
Well, and that goes back to like the philosophers of old, because when you look back into history, some of the best thinkers, especially around like the Socratic method, like Socrates and Aristotle and all those guys, like back then, a lot of the best leaders, thinkers, revolutionaries, whatever, they were warriors first and then thinkers after, because they learned and understood the mind-body connection. Like, for example, before we started the show, I was telling you guys about Dr. Andy Galpin and Dr. Andrew Huberman, which anybody who's listening to your show, if listeners don't know both of those names or one or the other, go Google them now. Go onto Spotify, look up Andrew Huberman Lab, like his podcast free, like obviously, and then Dr. Andy Galpin, like so. Andrew Huberman, real quick, he's a neurobiologist. Dr. Andy Galpin is I think he's an exercise physiologist, is what his doctorate is in. But so like back to the warrior thinkers of old, I guess you could say warrior philosophers of old. One of the things that was really, really popularized and is just now getting back into trendiness is like something as simple as taking cold baths. So like philosophers and warriors in Rome, they knew to do this. They already made the connection that it was good for heart health. Like they did this on a consistent basis because they realized that like by doing it, they felt specific effects. We're just now only just now learning the actual physiological mechanisms that do produce the positive health effects of something as simple as taking a cold bath. And like you can kind of like, that's where you can like, by establishing this foundation, as you so well put it, establishing this foundation of just making sure that your health is well centered. By doing that, by making sure that your body is secure, you also therefore secure your mind. And if you can secure your mind and your body, and then really use, because they both feed back on each other. The more you learn, especially the more you learn about movement, improves how you can build up your body. And the more you build up your body and understand and learn about like your movement again, feeds back into the mind, like because it improves some like topics as neuroplasticity, neurogenesis, like all this other stuff. So if you can produce this foundation of mind and body, make sure both are strong, healthy, and constantly improving, which sounds really, really daunting, but it's really a lot easier than most people think. If you can, when you can build a foundation like that, and then you start to branch out from that foundation and learn more about these more like complex systems and topics. When you can do something that, then you get closer and closer and closer to becoming a person of effect, like you're discussing, like, because if you're hard to kill physically, physiologically, nutritionally, immunologically, if you're hard to kill in that sense, but then you're also intelligent, and like how Jordan Peterson says, if you also are capable of communicating effectively, you become the most dangerous organism on the planet. And if you're dangerous, you're effective. And if you're effective, then you're valuable. And if you're valuable, then you can help push society and help raise effective members of society and raise the people up around you. That was a long tangent, so I apologize for that. But and I wrote about this in an article called that I titled "The People Pleaser Paradox," because largely in society, and we can tie this back into nutrition very easily. A lot of people in society have, like, over the last couple of decades that I've noticed, really kind of use is and this like, and it's like, especially within women, and I'm not being sexist or anything, like I love our ladies and all that, but like I've noticed particularly within like our women in the US that they use this title of, oh, like, I'm a people pleaser with a smile, like it's something to be proud of. It's not something to be proud of. Like, you don't want to be a people pleaser, because people pleasers are doormats. Whether they want to admit it or not, like, you get walked all over and taken advantage of. And it kind of feeds into the virtue signaling that's going on right now, because the whole kind of concept of the people pleaser is like, oh, you should sacrifice, like you should like sacrifice to support and support each other and everything. And I'm not saying supporting each other is bad. I just said that like supporting each other and uplifting everybody else around you is good. But like when you're doing it from the sense of a people pleaser, you're chopping off, you get to the point very rapidly where you chop off more than you can afford. And once you get to that point, you become a weight on those around you in your community and in your family and in your friend circle. And like, those are all their own communities, but then like there's also the overarching large community as a whole, whether it's a town or country. And when you get to the point of significant portions of the population, 1% or 10% of the population, reaching this limit of chopping off more than they can afford to support each other, then it gets to the point of that system becomes very cannibalistic very, very rapidly. And I think that's what we're going right now with regards to public health, nutrition, and all this other stuff, because people are sacrificing so much of themselves with regards to their time management, their physiological health, their psychological health, their nutritional health. And they're sacrificing so much across the board that they're now at wit's end. That's why so many systems have been, that's not why, but it's one of the contributing factors to why so many systems have been breaking, particularly in the last couple of years. Everybody's at wit's end.
I want to talk about the people pleasers paradox for a sec, because I think it's really interesting. It made me think of something that I was actually meaning to bring up earlier when you were talking, but this idea of outsourcing your thinking, which I think kind of plays into what you're saying. No, like I think we outsource a lot of things in today's world, and that can be said across different facets of individual people's lives or different industries. We outsource a lot of components of our life to other people, and
especially Americans.
Yeah. And it allows you to create dependencies that don't really need to exist, but in the modern world they can. And so I think that this dependency is now sort of what you're talking about, where people feel like they don't have control of what's happening and they don't know how to get it back.
And then that's where they adopt the nihilism that is rampant, at least in the United States.
Right.
I don't know what it's like over in Europe or anywhere else really, because I haven't traveled since my deployment. But the nihilism is the really, really, really depressing, dangerous part of all of this. So I definitely agree with you.
Do you want to hit on that nihilism point? Because I think it's like, it speaks to a lot of like I say this to friends that, I think that what I see in the Bitcoin community is basically the only corner of the world that has like any sense of optimism.
Well, it's not just optimism, but it's hope. And it's not just optimism or hope. It's like not everybody, but a large portion of the Bitcoin community is actually working on those sensations of hope and my optimism. And we're producing things that are actually having an effect. But the nihilism, you can see it in multiple different corners. So the nihilism, you can see it most rampantly, in my opinion, in the public health sector.
Mm-hmm.
So I think what's the average, like Joe Rogan's mentioned it multiple times now, like right now, the statistic is something like 40% of Americans are overweight.
Yep.
So one of the studies that I know I've mentioned to you, Clemenza, and on multiple other podcasts that I've done, is there's a study that I referenced in my Bitcoin magazine article where I talked about how dopaminergic diets, I think, are feeding into are mixing with social tendencies, social technologic tendencies, as far as like screen time overuse and reliance on music and video games and movies, that are creating dopaminergic responses that they're producing a negative feedback loop on social psychology that's creating a very addictive cycle that gets mixed with the high refined sugar contents within like everybody's diets. But the nihilism, I don't know where it would start, because I don't think it necessarily has a starting point, but like you can look at the health sector. The article that I just referenced on, that I got lost in my own tangent, was I wrote about the dopaminergic diets and how it's affecting society. And I referenced a study from the National Institute of Health that I think was published in I need to go back and double check, because I've said this like 8 times. I'm pretty sure the study was published on 2018 that said at that time's current pace, by 2030, 70% of the US population will at minimum be obese, if not morbidly obese. And that doesn't include the what would you call it, the panel of chronic metabolic conditions that come with that. Like, that doesn't include the type 2 diabetes that is currently spreading across the United States. That doesn't include the cardiovascular disease that is also spreading across the United States. That doesn't include the adipose tissue, which is like the obesity. That doesn't include the arthritis. That doesn't include the autoimmune diseases that are also sweeping across the country. Like, all of those come together, and then you look at how many people in the country are actually showing that they're interested in physical activity. It's not much. And physical activity is like the easiest response and treatment for the entire gambit of conditions. And then I say easiest in the sense of, I'm not saying it's easy to get started from like being sedentary and working out. That's difficult. And that's and pushing yourself to accepting like the levels of discomfort that come from that. I'm not saying that's easy. I'm saying it's easily accessible for everybody. Like, you don't need to spend $100 a month on a gym membership. No. Like, just go walk around your neighborhood, go walk around your town, go walk in your city. Like, just walk, drink more water, stop drinking pop. Like, stuff like that is very easy.
Yep.
But the nihilism that is like, and this also goes back to like when I first got into college after my stint in community college. When I first got into university, I was working as a student with one of the local universities with the operating rooms, because they're hot. Like the University of Iowa Hospitals and Clinics is one nationally renowned for our pediatric oncology center. It's the one in like the Kinnick Stadium, like NCAA games, where like everybody waves to the hospital center and everything. I was working down in that hospital as a student with the operating rooms, and don't quote, well, you can try and quote me on this, but it's not going to be legitimate. It's like, I would say like 90% of the cases that came through the operating rooms were caused by people either being obese or having a chronic metabolic condition.
Yeah.
And the people being obese getting like hip replacements, knee replacements because their arthritis is so bad, like all this other stuff. And I looked at these cases that were coming through, and I'm like, this could all just be solved if they would have started moving more and eating better 10, 20 years ago.
Yep.
And like it's the nihilism can, like, you can look at the health and like, how many people do we know just between the three of us that have lifestyle conditions that could be alleviated by just getting healthier? Like I know multiple just in my family and my close friend circle, and that's not even talking about like neighbors or like the community as a whole. And so like there's a legitimate sense of nihilism in the sense of like, oh, but I like pop, I don't want to stop it. So like they just adopt nihilism because it's easier. But then like the nihilism also carries over to the economic sector. Like the stock market is wildly overpriced historically, and by every metric. And people don't know how to get ahead because of inflation and because of the student debt that is just like weighing down an entire generation. People don't see a way to get ahead, so they just adopt nihilism again, and they give up and they start just racking up more debt. They're like, well, screw it, I can't get out of here. Like I can't get out of the lower class or the middle class. I can't find a way to get better. So I'll just, keep racking up the credit card, keep taking out the like mortgages, or like adding another lease for a car, or trading leases, which is ridiculously annoying to see people doing. But then they're like taking their money and then they're just like listening to what some talking head says on the TV. It's like, oh, put your money in this stock, it's doing great, without the layman understanding that by the time a stock is talked about by these talking head idiots, the value's already gone. Like it's already overpriced.
Yeah.
And then that goes back to the nihilism, because people are like, oh, it's too complicated, I don't have enough time to understand it. It's like, well, okay, adopting nihilism, then you'll never understand it. You'll never find a way to get ahead. And you will in fact produce a self-fulfilling prophecy of you will never get out of the rut that you're in. That was a really long rant again, so I apologize. I told you guys I had a lot of coffee this morning.
No, it's fantastic. We did want to talk to you about this. Speaking of getting ahead, from just a nutritional perspective, or even just training physical fitness, what are some systems that you've adopted over the years that have allowed you to quote unquote get ahead, or, maintain great body composition, overall health? What's the approach that you stick to, Mike?
So for health, your listeners will probably want a general sweeping answer, and I'm sorry guys, but that just doesn't exist.
We don't want it. No, go.
Okay. Because I was gonna say, because like everybody's is different. First of all, one of the things that I've noticed in people that I've trained and people that I've advised on training and all this other stuff is seeing what works for somebody else and then just wanting that to be what they want because they like the way somebody else looks. So like, for example, like if you're to compare myself versus somebody, like we'll use a hypertrophy coach on Instagram. I can't remember his name, but that's what his username tag is. Dude's a professional bodybuilder, all this other stuff. He's yoked in every way possible. So people will want to, it's easy to just see the things that he does and want to do exactly what he does, or some ridiculous fitness model that's doing ungodly amounts of work that are way more than anybody needs to do. Or like even the stuff that I do, the stuff that works for me is because I took an honest approach to how I understand my body to work. So genetically, like I told you guys, like in high school, like I was 6'1", lanky, super skinny. You have to start from that basis. So I'm someone who doesn't pack on weight easily. My body is, and this is a way that I described it to a lot of my clients throughout the past. If you're an individual, so one of the problems is weight gain. So we'll take it from that angle and ignore what I just said about myself. So like take it in an individual which is statistically likely to be somebody that's listening to your guys' podcast. Take an individual that struggles with weight gain. Like they put on more than they want. They can't seem to keep it off. What's the first thing that they're going to do? They're going to go to Instagram or whatever like media that they use. And then they're going to be told, oh, you need to do like full body movements. You need to do like cardio, like 3 times a week. You need to do high repetition work. That none of that necessarily makes sense in my opinion, because so like when you, and this goes back to a paper that I'm working on right now. So like when you look at physiologically at your body, you have to gauge how like the economics of your body as far as like ATP and energy and resources. So an individual that puts on weight easily means that their body is very, very, very skilled at resource retention, which means it's efficient at storage, right? Which makes sense. So if you have a body that is efficient at storage, then you need to improve the mechanisms with which to burn that excess storage off, which means growing muscle. And you guess what? You don't grow muscle by high repetition work. Like, and that's one of the things I've been fighting against, like ever since I finished my degree, even going through my degree, like I hated hearing within the academic circles that if somebody wants to lose weight, they need to do full body, high repetition work. That doesn't make sense because you have to treat it from an investment standpoint. So, and that goes back to the conversation we had, like that you mentioned earlier, with building a foundation. So if you want to burn off adipose tissue, like fat content, if you want to burn it off, then you have to produce a foundation that improves your metabolic demand or your caloric demand in your body. And the most calorically demanding organ in the body besides the brain is muscle. Because the brain burns like something like 20% of like your daily intake in calories, and that's largely spent on producing signals. But if you're an individual who's overweight and you want to not only lose weight but keep it off, you have to grow muscle. And if you're gonna grow muscle, you don't do high repetition full body moves necessarily. You have to have a workout scheme that supports hypertrophy. And now those strategies are gonna like kind of like slide forward and back a little bit depending on the individual, because we're all different, our bodies all work differently. But
and Mike, when you say supports hypertrophy, can you explain that just in layman's terms?
Yeah, so hypertrophy in layman's terms is essentially just like the mechanism of muscle growth. Because in like hypertrophy is really kind of like the and it's, yeah, like everybody calls it the breaking down of muscle tissue, but that's not necessarily true either, because like for hypertrophy, you have to take into account like time under tension, like muscle tissue time under tension. You have to take into account there's going to be some breakdown of the muscle, right? But you don't want to do too much to the point of where like it's negatively impacting your growth afterwards, which
Right.
Again, Dr. Galpin talks about. And then, but it's also mechanically loading the muscle in a particular sense that's heavy enough that like initiates the strength response as far as like the adaptation that produces the muscle growth that you want. That's a lot more complicated, but it's a lot more accurate as far as like an explanation of what hypertrophy is. Because you could do one of those three, but it's not gonna help you in the sense of, so like if you go too heavy, you're either gonna break down the muscle so much to the point of where it's actually negatively impacting your goals. Or if you go so heavy to the point of where you're not getting enough rep ranges to maximize the muscle growth stimulation and like mechanical fatigue. So you don't want to do it, like you don't want to lift so heavy to the point where you hurt yourself, and you don't want to lift so heavy to the point where you can't get enough reps in. But then you also don't want to lift so heavy to where you're violating technical form, right? And so that's where the complexity of the whole situation comes in, and that's where like getting a trainer is a good idea. But this goes back to like just like the general response of the public is like, oh, you want to lose weight, you should go run and do high endurance stuff. But that doesn't make sense, because the high endurance stuff doesn't result in muscle growth, which if it doesn't result in muscle growth, then it's not going to increase your caloric demand. And you don't increase your caloric demand, then you're not going to keep the fat off, and you're not definitely not going to burn it off. You might. So like one of the problems too with people, and like particularly in their health journeys, is if they're trying to lose weight, they'll do this stuff. They'll go run for like a week or two. They'll do too much because they're not following the system of progressive overload. Because they'll come out of like, it's been 10 years since high school, and they're like, oh, I used to run like, in like a 8-minute mile. So I'm going to go out and run an 8-minute mile. It's like, no, you've been sedentary for 10 years, you idiot. You're not going to be able to do that.
Right.
Like you might be able to push yourself to do it, and props to you if you can, but you're going to be so sore and so broken down because your body's not adapted to that kind of stimulus, that you're going to have to, like, if you don't take the time to properly recover from that, and then you try to continue on like your new workout journey after doing something like that, you're not only going to break down your body to the point of where it's actually cannibalizing what could be progress, you're also opening your body into so much unnecessary and obtuse stimulation and stress that it negatively impacts your immune system and opens you up to attack, in the sense of you can not only get sick but also hurt yourself.
Yeah,
that was a really long rant again.
You're 3 for 3 so far. We need at least 2 more good ones out of you.
I get it.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting point where a lot of people think that they can just go and kind of do what they used to,
Yeah.
and expect that they're going to be okay, which just generally is not the case.
Yeah.
Well, and like, and some of that is just like a mixture of inspiration, exuberance, excitement, and stuff like that. But people need to like get better at just, because people don't like hearing that their objectives aren't realistic. But the problem is that if you don't have realistic goals and expectations and you shoot too high, then you get into the situation of Osiris, and if you try and shoot too high, you get too close to the sun before you're ready, you're going to burn. And then you're going to come cascading back down to reality. Not only is the burn going to hurt, the fall's going to hurt, and the landing's going to hurt. So like, have fun dealing with that. That's not something anybody wants to deal with.
Yeah, it's an interesting point too. And that's what's so fascinating about nutrition, physical fitness, is it's one of like the fairest pursuits ever, because I feel like it's one of the only things in life that if you actually stay consistent to a strong dietary approach or even just a training plan, you will show progress, which, there's certain things in life that you can't stay the same for. Like sports is the perfect example. Like I trained as much as I could for baseball. I just had a certain genetic potential that I wasn't going to get to that next level, where I think fitness and nutrition is very different than that. So if you tell the average person, look, if you can only squat 95 pounds right now in the gym, as long as you continue to do that with good form and a good program, you'll get stronger. Yet they still have this tendency to want to put on like 135 or 155 because maybe they could do that like 2 years ago or something like that.
That's the ego too. That's
the
ego lifting.
100%.
And one of the cool things too that you also kind of touched on is like the genetic aspect. So that's another thing that they've learned particularly the last, I think, 10 years, is that we've learned that our DNA with consistent, significant enough consistent lifestyle changes and then sticking to them, we actually rewire our DNA. Like we actually reprogram our DNA. So in the sense of, if you were born somebody that packs on weight easily and is generally kind of like inclined to be overweight without like including like a workout regimen and like healthy diet habits, if you're an individual that realizes this early, decides to stick to a real physical activity schedule, routine, and then you leverage like all this other stuff, like making sure you're eating healthy, getting enough sleep, all this other stuff, and you're managing your stressors in your life into the sense of not only are you successful in looking good naked, but you're also successful in being healthy, which will also, you know, is most likely to cause you to be successful in other areas of your life. Individuals that are capable of doing that are capable of enacting so much change in themselves that the kids that they produce benefit from it. That's the real kernel of truth that most people don't understand, is like having these kinds of effects. Because like, imagine if you're someone like myself who doesn't have kids yet, but you understand this, you get excited for your kids that aren't in existence yet. You get excited for having kids in the future, because then you see that there's potential for like producing really dangerous individuals. And we already discussed, and like Jordan Peterson's talked about, it's like being dangerous is the most effective thing that anybody can do. And by realizing that, you not only get excited for being a parent, but then individuals that already do have kids that are making these changes, like maybe because you already have kids, you can't necessarily get those genetic DNA tweaking benefits that we just described, but going through those changes and steeling yourself and hardening yourself and making yourself a more effective member of society and a more effective parent is going to reflect upon your kids, because they're going to see that development. And because like one of the best ways to learn is through imitation. Those kids are going to imitate, and then those kids are going to learn from the parents. And then when those kids imitate, their bodies are benefiting and their minds are benefiting in a way like that. Like, there's no way to not get excited about the future when you approach things from this angle.
Yeah, I think that's a relentlessly positive way of thinking about self-improvement and how you can pass down self-improvement to the next generation. I think
like on that thread is like, you go back to like the Coach Carter quote from the movie, like when what's his name, Cruz, stands up to Coach Carter and he's like, we're not afraid that we're inadequate, we're afraid that we are powerful beyond measure. That's what people are afraid of, because they're afraid of like being the Osiris that gets too close to the sun and burns himself. They're afraid that they could actually realize that they are really dangerous individuals, which it's kind of makes sense, but it's nonsensical at the same time, right? Because like that, and this is where you kind of get into the Jordan Peterson psychological or the philosophical stuff, is like people don't want to realize that not only like, because like by acknowledging and realizing that we're powerful beyond measure doesn't just mean that we're like capable of accomplishing greatness. We're also capable of accomplishing greatly terrible things. And yeah, we got philosophical, so I apologize, but man, like I don't see how you can't.
It seems like there's really those two paths in life, right? Like the one is you make yourself dangerous, and you kind of have to venture into the unknown a bit when you go down that path. So you have to accept some uncertainty. But in accepting that uncertainty, you're also letting yourself grow into something that is able to handle that. And then the other path, which I think if you look at where we're at today and you look at society, this is the path that most people choose, which is the safety and dependency, and the not so dangerous version of yourself where you know what you're going to get. And so I think that there's something to that whole choosing your lane, and the one that is uncertain is the one that a lot of people are afraid to go after. And the people who are going down that lane in life, I think, really are growing into a different version of themselves. And then the other way is just seems like this kind of conformist mind. But yeah, again,
there's a little bit of a lack of observation, a lack of awareness, and a lack of honesty with people's approach to those like two different lifestyles, right? Because on the side that you mentioned of as far as like seeking safety and predictability, in those lifestyles is what the general 9 to 5, commuting to work, coming back, taking your kids to school, like all that stuff, right? But people aren't openly and honestly acknowledging the risks that they're taking in those lifestyles, because something as simple as getting in a car and driving on a highway with thousands of other morons that are easily distracted while they're driving, that's a lot of risk. And that's why it's statistically safer to fly than it is to drive, because you're not putting yourself on the road with thousands of other people that are statistically likely to be distracted while they're driving, either visibly or psychologically or both, that are driving multiple ton automobiles at anywhere from 50 to 90 miles an hour, all together in unison, all while having like opposing lanes of traffic. That's a lot of risk. That's a lot of risk. But people but we're so desensitized to it that people don't see it as taking risk. Or like putting money into an index like the S&P 500, that's a risk because everything is so overvalued. But because it's been so popularized or destigmatized over the last couple of decades, it's like, oh, it's what everybody does. If it's what everybody does, that's a risk. Yeah. Like that is a huge risk. It's just, it's interesting to see how, again, like these holes in observational awareness and lack of honesty is creating all of these like essentially bubbleistic style environments that are really, really dangerous, and people need to be aware of them.
I think this goes back to a point that I love the fact that you just said observational awareness. I think we've lost that connection in a lot of different realms. And I think the one that I think of is nutrition. Like if you ask people, like, how did that pizza make you feel? Or how did that meal make you feel? A lot of people aren't totally in tune with how the food is
not even close
body, right? Like most people don't know what's happening, and they can't have an objective view on or really get a good sense of how they're feeling just based on observation. So going back to one of my points earlier, they have to outsource their thinking to other people. They go, oh, doctor, tell me how I'm feeling. Like this is the result.
Like, well, the doctor can't tell you because the doctor isn't experiencing within your body, so they can't tell you how you're feeling. Yeah, that's a good point. And part of that too comes from the fact that people don't understand how what we eat interacts with our bodies. So, like for example, I actually I kind of used my mom as an experiment over the last couple of years, which sounds bad, but I wasn't like,
you have to explain that one.
I wasn't poking and prodding my mom. But one of the things, like, so I got my genetics from her in the sense of like, we keep weight off. Like genetically, we have high metabolism. And in the last couple of years, due to age and other things, like she's been noticing like, some weight gain and stuff like that. So I just started having her like just be more intentional with what you notice after you eat particular things and after like your activity is following a trend. So like, cause like she like I made a workout plan for her and everything, especially during the lockdowns, like when you couldn't go work out. But so the first thing I had her do is I was like, okay, I just want you to be observational with your normal daily routine. Like pay attention to how you feel when you wake up normally, when you just continue to eat the things that you eat, because you have, again, this goes back to what Salazzo mentioned with establishing a foundation. You have to start with a baseline or like a control group, or you don't know what the hell you're doing or what's working or not. So what I had her do, I was like, just pay attention to how you feel when you eat, like when you eat normally and when you eat particular things that aren't necessarily in the norm, because both of those things are very, very important data points. And so as we were going through like the first couple of weeks of lockdown, I would chat with her and discuss with her. It's like, okay, well, how'd you feel when when the night was winding down and you admittedly like snacked on like a bag of chips? How'd you feel? Because it's not necessarily that day or that night. It's going to be the next day. when all those nutrients make their way into the body, and then that's when you feel the effects. And this goes back to another problem with the observational awareness with just society in general, is particularly in the US, is people expect corrections to happen immediately.
Yes.
And this goes back to a problem that I've had this discussion with, I think, over a dozen people over the last couple of weeks, over the dynamics that have developed over the last couple of years. So I'm going to table that observational awareness conversation real quick for a second, because I've noticed in the last 4 to 8 weeks, there's been a lot of people, both inside the Bitcoin community and outside, that have come to me talking to me about how they believe that there is no such thing as objective truth. All truth is subjective because of the massive violations of trust that have happened between US government, health organizations, all this crap that's happening. So because people are having their grounding in reality shook up so aggressively, they think that there is no, like, the objective truth doesn't exist because reality hasn't corrected yet. And this goes back to, you can talk about this in physiology, you can talk about this in philosophy, you can talk about this in economics. Reality corrects when it is time to correct. That is the only time reality ever corrects. Reality doesn't, and this kind of goes back to like the philosophical stuff, like Gandalf, like a wizard is always on, like he always arrives when he means to, right?
Yeah.
Reality only corrects when it is meant to. And that's typically when variables and conditions all like come together on a converging tipping point and has enough energy to finally mean revert and start to bring everything back to reality. So, like, for example, in the stock market, it's a really easy one to use. Look at how many companies have been zombie companies particularly since 2008, that haven't produced a new product that you could argue aren't worth the amount that they're worth right now because they haven't produced a new product. They haven't improved upon the product. They have a slew of competitors that have propped up since then that arguably produce products that are not only comparable, but sometimes better. Like, you could look at Kodak or Hertz, for example. They should have died. They should have died a long time ago. But because the signal mechanism as far as the market has been disrupted because of easy monetary policy, and because that easy monetary policy is fraudulent, it's screwing up the signaling mechanism of the market. So reality hasn't corrected yet. Those companies are dead. They're zombies. But reality hasn't corrected yet because the rest of the market hasn't realized how fraudulent the monetary system is, because the monetary system is the signal. And if the signal is false, then the signaling mechanism is also false. And that means reality is like, it's like, again, Jordan Peterson, again, he talks about how reality is like a rubber band. You can manipulate it all you want. It's going to reach that point of where, like, tension is maximized, and then shit's just going to come crashing back and snap back into reality. You can only manipulate and twist reality so far before it reaches that tipping point. Things start to steer against you, and then it just snaps back rapidly. And you'll see that in markets with aggressive sell-offs going into recessions, because that's when everybody realizes, like, what the signal actually is, and then markets sell off because everyone's like, oh, this isn't good. Like, I'm getting out before there's more pain. And then, so you go back to the conversation that we tabled, is observational awareness. And this goes back to nutrition and physiology. When you guys eat something that is complete crap, you might have signals immediately, like as far as like a sugar high or a sugar crash or something like that. But the real, like, correcting mechanism isn't going to be felt until at least that next day, or like weeks going on, because that bad thing that you ate, that crap nutrition that you just engaged in, is going to have significant effects on the microscopic level. And there are trillions of cells in our bodies. And so when you have small changes that are consistent and repeated exponentially, that's where you get to big macro developments. So, and this is where you can tie in health and economics, in the sense of the small purchases that the three of us make at the grocery store are very, very minute. But when you expand that kind of activity across 300 million individuals, then you get to see how impactful economics and markets really are, because those are what's driving the other developments as far as like, so like with inflation, what's going on right now, we haven't seen the correction for reality yet, because we haven't had all those 300 million microtransactions for groceries and for like living expenses and for all those other things across markets for long enough yet to see the actual effects. And the same thing happens within the body. When you like what you eat, those resources is going to take weeks to months for you to see it actually play out. And then on top of that, after like while it's taking time to play out, they're also expanding upon themselves as you continue to engage in that activity. Right.
Absolutely.
Because it's like, especially if you're engaging in like consuming high refined sugar, high fructose corn syrup, like those kinds of products that have massive glycemic index scores, that have huge insulin responses. When you eat one day, when you have a day where you eat a lot of that crap and like it's hard on your system, it's only temporarily hard. But when you continue to do it, not only are you increasing insulin tolerance in your cells, which means your cells are less susceptible to reacting to sugar, which means that they're getting more tolerant, like in the sense of getting more tolerant against alcohol. It means it's going to take more sugar to have the same effect on your cells, which they're designed to have. Like you want to have low insulin tolerance. Like you want to have your body very sensitive to sugar because you're supposed to. But when you continue to do that over weeks, months, years, decades, and you continually contribute to the tolerance buildup, that's the rubber band stretching out. And then getting the type 2 diabetes or getting the cancer or getting the arthritis or getting all of it, that's the snapback to reality. And then like, yeah, we're going through a lot of it right now.
Yep. Yeah, the reality correction of nutrition is particularly intriguing. And Clemenza and I talk about this, how the average person, and I had to go through this phase on my own, you can show them a picture of steak and eggs, right? Where I think the three of us can agree, one of the most nutrient dense, nourishing things you could put into your body for performance,
liver, yeah.
Right? The average person that hasn't necessarily delving into this nutritional space that we're all in, they look at steak and eggs and see it as the correlation of heart disease, metabolic disease, all these other things.
I see salt, cholesterol. Yeah.
It's so interesting. And there are these products like Oatly, like Beyond Beef, et cetera, that have been propped up through having these massive marketing budgets that are perceived as being healthy or, environmentally beneficial, that are actually terrible for you, that are going to lead to the chronic inflammation and all the other things that you just talked about. So I don't know, it's just very interesting to look at it from a nutritional perspective on what's perceived as being healthy and what is actually healthy versus what is actually detrimental to your health.
Oh, and they're also environmentally not healthy. Yeah. Clemenza and I can talk about this because the products that go into those Beyond Meat, like the soy, are heavily reliant on industrialized farming. And industrialized farming is highly reliant on fertilizers, pesticides, and herbicides. Those products are highly reliant on oil and gas. And oil and gas is going through absolute hell right now because of what's going on geopolitically, right? But then the systems that rely on that fertilizer, pesticides, and herbicides, the industrialized farming, those systems are so nutritionally and ecologically unhealthy for the environment underneath the surface of the soil, that they're dramatically destroying the ecosystems underneath, like just below the surface, to the point of, because like plants rely on the micro ecology within the soil itself. Is like, that's the bacteria that's breaking down like all the nutrient contents of, like, whether it's a log, a carcass, or whatever, breaking everything down into the minerals like phosphorus and actually uptakeable nitrogen that plants need for the root systems, because plants can't just take nitrogen out of like any form. Like plants are just as particular and specialized as our bodies are. So plants need a specific form of phosphorus and nitrogen and sulfur and all this other stuff to be able to take them up. And there's bacteria in the soil that survive and reproduce and grow that produce those kinds of, they produce them as a waste product from their own operations. And then the root systems take them up that way. And the funny thing about all those, you know, those green projects like Beyond Meat and all that other crap, they rely on this style of farming so much that this style of farming rapidly destroys the health of like the soil ecosystem to the point of where it's actually cannibalizing itself and nobody sees it. Nobody realizes it because those ecosystems underneath the surface of the soil are so sensitive to like one of the most common practices that you can probably go to kids out on the street right now and they'll be able to point to a picture and tell you what tilling is. Like tilling is very, very simple, but so the surface of the soil, like where the root system is gonna it's basically the skin of the earth. And once you break open that skin and expose the mycorrhizal ecology underneath, those guys are super sensitive to light radiation, to exposure to oxygen, exposure to heat, exposure to wind, exposure to rain, like all of it. And so it's easy to like really negatively impact those systems. And those systems produce the nutrient density of the soil that produces the nutrient density of the crops that we eat. And the fact that those Beyond Meat joke synthetic meat products are like wrapping themselves up as some sort of environmental and social good is just so aggressively wrong that people like, and that goes back to like the complexity of the system. That's like, and like people don't understand it because they're nihilistic, like we talked about. They don't want to have to put in all the effort to understand it, but then people will put in the time to understand it once things get so bad that they can't afford not to look at it. And that's what I think that's what the three of us are all working to try and avoid. It's like, guys, we don't need the world to end to realize that we can fix it. Right.
Yeah. I think that's our hope with the Meat Mafia is to have some informed conversations with people at levels that everyone can participate in and enjoy. And I think that what we're also trying to bridge to is the knowledge of what you just talked about, which is our food system is suffering from this massive industrialized process that will lead to one of two things happening. And I think that if we work hard, there's still enough time to get things right. But our food system is very fragile and not enough people understand that. And I hope that more people get closely engaged with the food system, because that is it's going to become very important here quickly as food prices continue to go up. And I think a lot of people are going to have to be relying on local food systems in a much more meaningful way. So
yeah, and it's a lot. So I know we're running out of time here, but there's one other thing too I wanted to add real quick that is very relevant to like the Beyond Meat and the soil health and the kind of general virtue signaling that's going on when people look at like steak and eggs versus something like tofu. So, and I know Clemenza, you and I have talked about this at least once or twice, but so the mental health crisis that's also occurring, that is occurring in tandem with the chronic metabolic syndrome crisis that's happening, the mental health crisis plays into, it is intermeshed with that same exact crisis. So like when we look at these processed foods, the inflammation response that is coming from these processed foods is affecting mental health in the sense of it's screwing up the neurotransmitter balance in the brain. It's like, well, maybe not neurotransmitter, that's technically not correct, but the inflammation screws with the signals in our brain that like dictate our cognition and our mood and everything else. But then at the same time, like you said, the processed industrialization of like our food products, there's a book that I've been telling everybody they need to read, particularly young women. is called Countdown by Dr. Shanna Swan. It's a red copy. She's I can't remember what her title is, but she's a doctorate in fertility studies. And so in this book, she goes like, she doesn't waste any time. She gets straight into talking about how it's not just what we're eating that is affecting our mental health and our fertility, but it's also the things that are going on that are also equally as industrialized. So like the high reliance of plastic products rely heavily on a compound called phthalates. And these phthalates are what she refers to as EDCs, or endocrine disrupting compounds. And these endocrine disrupting compounds, they screw up the sex hormone homeostasis in our bodies. And that means estrogen and testosterone and progesterone. But particularly for this conversation, estrogen and testosterone. When these two hormones are not in proper balance in our bodies, whether you're male or female, screws up all sorts of shit. So like we're all guys, so I'll talk from our standpoint. When our testosterone is low, and like guys, we follow kind of like a monthly cyclicality, a lot like women. There will be like that one point every 30 days where we're just, our lows for testosterone, our testosterone levels are low just because of the part of the cycle. But when guys' testosterone is low, not only is muscle protein synthesis lower, but mood is worse, right? Because if you're low in testosterone, it's typically associated with emotionality and all this other stuff, right?
Right.
And then that's going to contribute to like the decisions you make when you're eating, the decisions you make in your daily life, like all this other stuff.
Totally.
So like there's so much shit happening, and though like that balance gets disrupted by the heavily processed foods, because the heavily processed foods not only screw up the dopaminergic system that I kind of like touched on earlier, but then you're also still consuming some of these plastic products in those foods because it's unavoidable. Whether it's in your water or whatever, you're still getting these endocrine disrupting compounds in you, and it's contributing to the decision making. And it's worse by these Beyond Meat, synthetic meat, tofuized like products that are just completely detrimental to public health.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack with all this. I do feel like there's a day where all of it, like you were saying before, these realities, these natural laws. I mean, we are subject to natural laws at a certain point, and we will have that rubber band moment.
Oh, and fun fact real quick for your listeners is like when Salazzo talks about looking at steak and eggs, most people see just salt and fats. But if you're trying to be a healthy and effective individual, you need the fats and cholesterols that are in those products, because cholesterol is used to produce testosterone and estrogen. So guess what? You need to eat that fat that's on that steak. You need to get the cholesterol that is in those eggs. Like, I'm sorry, but like your virtue signaling and your moral justification to eat one particular form of life over another makes you a complete idiot.
We're going to make t-shirts with that on it.
Yeah, it's actually crazy the confusion that the majority of people have between saturated fat that you're ingesting versus like the actual adipose fat that's on your body, and the correlation that people think that eating fat is going to make you fat, when it's actually essential to you living an incredibly optimal life and having a full nutritional profile. So it's just that it's fascinating.
Every cell in the body has a lipid membrane. Well, not every cell, but the majority of cells have a lipid membrane. And guess what? Lipids means fats. So if you're trying to grow and be healthy, which even if you're not trying to grow muscle, you're still constantly growing, because your body has a turnover rate of cells, because your cells don't live forever, because you don't live forever. Or I guess you don't live forever because your cells don't live forever. But the point is that you're constantly replacing cells in your body or building on top of old ones. In order to do that, you need fats and protein.
Mike, this has been a killer riff. Where can people find you, and like what can people expect from you in the future? Where are you thinking about writing more about, and then where can people find you?
People can really just find me on Twitter. My handle is @the Mike Hobart. I'll spell it out because people seem to misspell it. So the with 2 E's, THEE, Mike, MIKE, and then Hobart, HOBART. And then to what to expect from me going into the future, I'm working on a relatively big paper where I am comparing. I won't get into the particulars because I kind of want it to be a surprise for people that I haven't told about or told it about to yet. But the teaser is that I'm taking an uncommon comparison of very common economies. And I think that should be enough to at least perk some interest from a few people. And then I have a couple other articles coming out for Bitcoin Magazine so I have one coming out where I interviewed a woman who actually said that because she came to Bitcoin, because she understood Bitcoin, because she understood like the whole investment and the nature of like hard money and like establishing a foundation, by coming to Bitcoin, she actually understood why investing in health was so important. So it's because she came to Bitcoin that she improved her health, and she's been talking to me about all these other improvements that she's noticed since then, which is awesome. And then
I love that.
I have a couple of other articles I have coming out, but I honestly don't remember what they were about because I've been writing so much.
Dude, you're on fire. You've been crushing it. I think if anyone's listening and hasn't come across your stuff yet, it's a must follow, and they'll get a ton out of just all the articles you're putting out. You're just a volume guy. I feel like you put out
Thanks,
a lot of really good stuff. So
appreciate it.
This has been great. Let's call it a wrap, and we'll have to do this again soon.
Yeah, let's do this again to where I don't talk as much. So like we can get some even back and forth between you guys, and maybe the conversation can be evil in the sense of potency.
No, we could listen to you talk for hours, man. I wish we could go longer. So we'll definitely do a part 2 within the next couple of weeks. If you want to come back on, we'd love to have you again.
There's no if. I want to come back on. I'll talk to you guys.
Let's do it. All right, gents. Till next time.
See you guys.
See you.